I'm curious how much folks looked into sort of what this paper is in response to. Because as I was doing this and trying to talk about it, I realized like I don't really fully understand the. I wasn't that familiar with the original one, like, but like the original paper from Geldman, is it?
Oh, Van
Um,
Gelder, yeah. I
yeah,
had to
Van Gelder.
I had to I read some of it to try to figure it out.
I'm curious if you want to start with that or just launch into your notes, Amanda. But take it away if you want to go into anything.
Sure, we can start with the beer paper itself because
Mm-hmm.
part of what I found most helpful just as a way to start the discussion is the way he disambiguates dynamics uh, and the way he describes what should be the focus of cognitive science. So, yeah, he spends some time responding to this Van Gelder paper, which I feel like we must have talked about it in a Saturday morning years ago. But he also is, Beer is also responding to, it seems, just generally the way DST is used in cognitive science, like the way it shows up in discussions.
Mm-hmm.
So I liked this paper just as a way to think about all of the places where dynamics could come into play. So he starts by disambiguating what is dynamic. He lists five different things that it could mean. First is a phenomenon to be explained. He says it's the job of science to explain the nature and mechanisms of change. So you look out into the world and you see patterns, you see the way things change through time, and that itself is something uh, for science to explain the nature and mechanisms of change. Second, it's a type of model. So you can model a phenomenon with a set of differential equations, and then that's a dynamic model. So you can have computer simulations of various phenomena. That's a dynamic model. Third, it's a general mathematical formalism. So he says that all kinds of things could be put into this formalism, which has these three components that I did not write down the specifics of S, T, and it's like this initial state, the set. Basically, it's very general. It's a very general mathematical formalism. It's a dynamical systems theory is a conceptual framework that provides a worldview and a language. So basically, it's a way of noticing patterns in the world. You can look at phenomena through DST lenses, and it's a way of like categorizing what you see. And then fifth, he starts discussing Van Gelder's dynamical hypothesis, which is that cognitive systems are dynamical systems and therefore should be studied as such. So Beer criticizes this for being at best uninteresting and at worst like incoherent. He asks, does anyone wish to claim that a solar system literally is a set of differential equations? So Beer goes on to ask, well, what is cognition? So what is the thing that we're trying to apply DST to?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, first, taking a step back, he says that dynamic systems theory can be applied at various levels of the system, various types of phenomenon. So on one hand, you have the phenomenal level, which is the level of like what we observe, the patterns we observe. So he uses Kepler and the solar system as an example. So dynamics can be applied there to model the patterns, or it could be applied at the mechanistic level in an attempt to model the components and their interactions that uh, give rise to what's observed. So you can either directly take the patterns that you see and come up with the equations, or maybe there are other categories. Maybe it's not just these two, but I couldn't come up with. This seemed pretty. Or you can focus on the underlying level and try to model the components with equations that then create the thing that you observe. So basically, it's not very to say that cognition is dynamical. That can mean many things, both because dynamics is ambiguous and also what do we mean when we say cognition. So he says a little bit, but then says that a better question would be like, what are the mechanisms that underlie behavior, cognitive behavior or otherwise? He says that generally the behavior that's deemed cognitive is just what we find interesting, and it depends on who you're asking. So his question is, what are the mechanisms underlying behavior? And his beginning of an answer is that behavior is a property of the brain body environment system and not of one component. So that's a theme that's come up in this group many times. It's like the foundation of Fuchs's book. Fuchs focuses on the brain, but his thesis is that the brain is a part of the body, is a part of the environment. So you can't really focus on one part.
Vertical
I don't
and
know if there are
horizontal
any.
causality, yeah.
Right, you have horizontal and vertical causality. Everything is intertwined. So I feel like if there are any axioms of our group, like this is one of them, that the object of interest is the brain body environment system. The last little bit I want to say is one of the questions that has been most interesting to me for years now, like since last time this group was very active, is how. So we have a set of conceptual frameworks, so dynamic systems theory, but then we've discussed synergetics, which might be very closely related, cellular automata, computation, like more classical computation. There are various, like abstract, supposedly very general and potentially very explanatory conceptual frameworks. But then how, not just like when is which one appropriate, but how might they fit together? If you're explaining a whole brain body environment system, when is using one framework like truly explanatory versus one? So basically, how does dynamic systems theory fit into, like, how compatible is it with other ways of approaching the problem? Beer says that these other frameworks are given as additional layers of explanation. That's his language. So information processing, representation, prediction, probabilistic inference, and so on can be productively applied to specific features of a fundamentally dynamical agent under particular circumstances. So if you take dynamical systems theory as the starting point, it doesn't preclude others that might be more popular in orthodox cognitive science, like talking about representation and information. So they're not mutually exclusive. In certain circumstances, giving that kind of explanation in addition to a dynamical explanation could be productive and truthful and fruitful. Though, he says, without requiring them. So dynamical systems theory wouldn't require these additional terms if DST is a successful explanation. And then earlier in the paper, he says if there is any debate to be had about dynamics versus computation, it concerns only which provides the more productive framework for research, which provides the more appropriate theoretical language for cognitive science, as opposed to the question being which is like more capital T true. Yeah, I'm not sure what I make of that yet, but I appreciated reading his take on how these things could potentially fit together.
I think one thing I'm interested in is it seems like I've seen different attempts at like in different fields of integrating seemingly competing theories as different useful tools in a toolbox that get brought out for different particular applications or contexts. And I guess like I'm less aware of, are there examples of like research programs that are actively utilizing that awareness, and how is that like what does a research program that is more concerned about whether computation or dynamics is more relevant, like how will that actually shape concretely the different goals and methods of a research program or what they're trying to do versus the lack of awareness there?
Good question. I don't have any clear answer. Oh, Morgan.
I don't know if this is helpful, but I posted Yann LeCun's recent talk on world models. I thought it was a good overview of why he felt that particular programs were going to be insufficient. So he was kind of talking, he was making some of a case about the difficulties.
Was this
That
it?
was that's a separate one.
I don't know.
It just world models have been on my mind.
Okay, sorry.
So no,
Yeah.
and the Simons Institute had a lot of the same, like Gopnik, as well as like other people who are, if anything, I think the speaker list at the Simons Institute is like you could kind of guess who was going to be there, and this is definitely some overlap between like Santa Fe Institute speakers and people, kind of coming from a Josh Tenenbaum, like 1 foot, like a big consideration being developmental cognitive science, right? And like, so I think he makes a good case for the difficulties that learners have being, from the amount of information they have and with as dynamic an environment as they have of like what strategies will be feasible. Like, so again, I'm not sure if this is exactly what you're getting at, but like he's trying to show that there's certain developmental phenomena that just don't work from a kind of pure computational approach, that you need something else driving the system.
I do have one question for Amanda. I think you mentioned last week that you were curious how he would explore how the dynamical model is situated relative to other models, like the synergistic one. I don't think this entirely answered that, but do you feel like it started to answer that in any satisfying way for you?
Like this paper and what Spear has to say?
Yeah.
Uh, mm, he's not talking about any particular phenomenon or explanation yet. Um, so it kind of makes sense to me in theory what he's saying in that first quote. Um, it kind of seems like he's the. I mean, I trust that he's not contradicting himself, but it kind of seems to me like there's tension between that the first thing he says and the second about additional layers of explanation.
I think the work. This is the sort of the work of like, the theoretical work, the science work, like the old Zen koan of like you don't get to see the whole reality. You just have these like little slices of it, and you try to make these break it down into bite-sized chunks and then reconstitute it, and like how just awkward that whole approach is. And I think there's something to steelmanning. I'm very much trying to like figure out how to talk to this, encourage this in other like people that I'm mentoring or whatever. But I think there's a point to steelmanning, like making your argument in theory as good as it can be, even if it gets in sort of Karl Popper sense proven wrong later. Or like Van Gelder, like I think there's something to write those papers where he's like, hey, I'm going to exclude all of this stuff and just focus on this quantitative thing, and I know I'm making it, but I want to do this so we can move the discussion forward and get talking about the ideas down the road. I think there's something to that, and there's something to both doing that work, the positive work, the critical work, and then trying to do the hardest thing is the synthetic work. I'm very interested in how do we try to do the synthetic. We're going to dance around here in these things, but how can we try to bridge all that into a functional, coherent, structured way to do that work? So to come back to that later, we now have Avery's for sharing allostatic kinds presentation.
So for context, this is a framework I made several years ago. Originally, I wanted it to be inspiration for exploring different agent-based simulations based off of this, and how it had different agents interact, and have different models of strategies for regulation, and how that could impact the cooperation or show up in their own strategies and interactions with their environment. That didn't really pan out due to personal life reasons and getting overwhelmed. However, since then I have developed a few more intuitions about different approaches and ways I can articulate it. it's still not the most rigorous. So think of this more as like, here's a general idea, here's some leads I'm thinking about in terms of how to articulate it. So the basic idea is that it's talking about this allostatic kind is a dichotomy that's polytomy that's exploring the different permutations of relations between objective and subjective content. You can also think as agent and environment, or organism and environment. It was interesting to discover that a person who writes about second-order cybernetics uses similar language in one of his papers. He talks about subjective, intersubjective, and objective criteria for knowledge, and how all of those are vital factors and factors for proliferation of information. But yeah, I was interested in how this could be an interesting way of exploring really kind of obviously salient strategies that people take for self-regulation. And like, for context, allostasis, roughly speaking, is the processes we take in order to better adapt, be able to regulate in our environment. And I believe that these are like information that is salient towards those strategies. We can move to the next slide. So part of what the inspirations of this are different authors from phenomenology, embodied cognition, that talk about ecological cognition, that talk about how the organism and the environment are intertwined and co-constituted. And as part of that, from that intuition, it's the idea of like, what if that part of that co-coupling the positionality and direction of the different dynamics in that relationship actually have different qualities or form information clusters, or clusters of useful causal information. And you can go on to the next slide. I haven't read the most about causal information, but I was interested to read I heard Erik Hoel present about his paper when the, what was it? When the map...
The map better than a territory.
Yeah, so like an example of that would be how like the concept of a traffic stop contains more information describing the individual cars in terms of effective information, useful information density, and effective information as something you can measure in the system.
Yeah, I think
that's been applied. So I was thinking that like allostatic kinds could be thought of as sort of analogous to that, but horizontal, where like not the only kind of horizontal emergence, but one specific relevant layer of that, or kind or differentiator of that, where the positionality, directionality, and like origin and conclusion point of different causal relationships actually can be more useful when described at that particular slice of things happening in that direction than talking about the system as a whole for particular problems. Which makes sense when I think about like both like intuitively how people around me talk about issues. And yes, there's integratory things too, but I guess this would be sort of like a different hypothesis I want to explore with this would be like people resolve, like for example people resolve affordances by first in each of these denser clusters of highly related information coming to using different reasoning or tools, or like each of them might even have competing, like in the sense you kind of have a body in each, like in an abstract sense. How I tend to think of it is that you sort of have a body making sense of the environment in each of these different ways, and sometimes they're incompatible. Like a lot of the times, like this sounds abstract, but like what your heart says might not reflect what your brain says, like in a very like human felt way. And I think those just about like different information density clusters of information dense causal information about you, your environment, and regulation that are about a different slice of how and direct based off functionality. And then people come to conclusions more easily intra-domain, and then apply, and then there are ways to integrate that afterwards, but I do think people tend to come to like reduce that dense information down to useful conclusions that are more easily combined together into a unified sense of your affordances in your environment.
Yeah, I think we've like in the past we've been using some language around like non-uniformity, like symmetry breaking, different weights, different non-uniformity of personal experience. And I think that's sort of phenomenology as this neglected space in terms of, well, we can only bring so much rigor to it and so on. But within that cluster of problems is like, well, even approaching phenomenology in certain aspects may require the dealing with the non-uniformity that you were getting at. Like part of why there isn't, I always like, I call it like the cell phone analogy. Why are cell phones so much easier to produce than like, what's one of the best recent popular takes on what's going on in a world? Inside Out, core emotions, and big simple things like there's a reason why one set of things develops a lot more easily, and maybe that comes down to, yes, symmetry breaking and also economics behind it for sure. I think your theories and your work is trying to take some bold efforts to map out and demarcate some of the mechanisms that are at play.
Yeah.
There's things that can emerge that we can see, but maybe we can't have the empirical stuff for it quite yet as we're doing this theoretical work.
It's part of my broader intuition that part of how humans make sense of the world is to having consistent, formats for complex information that is related to notions of directionality, positionality, and
I think
exploiting and specializing in asymmetries in the representation of oneself in the environment. And I think allostatic cognition is just one of the more, it's really easy to get, and I think it's really like extremely integrated into our culture. It's like in every other self-help book in like a weird way. It's tarot, it's alchemy, it's Enneagram, it's kind of everywhere, but it's not like formalized in a philosophically grounded, like, what is this phenomenon kind of way.
I would liken this a little bit towards like, I think this is some of adjacent to like in the anthropic paper we looked at, and sort of these archetypical clusterings in the space overall where certain things are going, or like where these sort of, I don't know what you want to call it. Yeah, go ahead.
So yeah, I don't think this is like the answer for how people integrate information. I do think it's like one salient set of categorizations or like, mental affordance formats that people divide the environment to or come to when they're trying to resolve potential actions or position or stances to take in their environment. I think it makes sense. It's one of the more intuitive ones that shows up cross-culturally, and it gets constantly mentioned everywhere and more in different, as part of just basic human communication. And the conflicts and the incompatibilities between those information types are like constantly mentioned as well. And as well as like the need to like, the difficulty and the need for like feeling each one out and then like combining them once you've like already like, what's the word? Resolved. Or like identifying the relevant one for the problem space, or clearing out each one and then integrating after you come to your own sense of balance or a resolved point about each.
I keep going back to non-uniformity of regulation. We say different non-uniformity of person, not just a regulatory pattern, but how individuals may have chirality or lopsidedness or a non-uniform, not a straight square, but edges that point out and stick up and stick down and result in different disparities, meaningful disparities in the regulatory process itself. So, yeah.
I think my concrete steps are like, what would it look like for an agent in an agent-based environment to be able to have competing strategies about this internally and interpersonally, and what would that look like in terms of cooperation and individual strategization in the environment?
Yeah, I
think that was a concrete probably wanted to a long time ago. I think I have more of the chops and wherewithal to go through with it now.
Yeah, exactly. So this is sort of a, we all have our things that we pick up and put down for different reasons. So I'm glad that you joined this. I think as you get more language and get exposed to like these meetings and other meetings and kind of seeing, okay, here's some like, some cognitive science stuff, some complexity science stuff, it will help you get at what you're trying to get at, because I do think there's something there. So yeah, that's the top of the hour. I will hold for final comments or questions or like a little bit of talk about what to do next. I don't know if you have any suggestion papers that we want to do or paths to follow.
I have a quick comment if you could go back to the fifth slide.
Sure.
So, if I've understood everything, perhaps there are like infinite columns here. There are so many different manifestations of this pattern in different philosophies and religions and contemporary psychological jargon. And so a very interesting one to me is like Plato's ethics.
Oh.
I don't remember the details, but he splits the human spirit into three components that roughly line up with like cognitive and emotion, and I can't remember exactly. But for Plato, human flourishing is when all of those forces are in alignment, when there's a harmony and there's no inner conflict. Instead there's eudaimonia, when all of these forces are in harmony and there's no conflict between them.
Yeah, because it's not always four, but it tends to be those four are brought. That these three are brought up, and they tend to be. But yeah, that's a very useful example, especially when I'm talking to like philosophy people. So thank you for that.
You're welcome. It also brings like an ethical dimension, which is maybe like far outside what you want to do, or maybe not. But like Plato is trying to articulate what the good life is using these maybe very similar terms to what you're.
Yeah, I loosely think allostasis is weirdly compatible with virtue ethics, but that's not something I've like super about.
I think there's, to play the connection game, some things about like the modifiers on the negative feedback to the goal and what that means in terms of behavior, the virtue ethics, the ethical component, and I think also I'll add in like not just what does this say, like these features or these almost like the sort of tesseract, the shadow of the tesseract is the square. We're seeing these like square like similarities that aren't we can't really measure the tesseract properly, but the shadow is like, okay, we get nuts cube looking thing. I think there's something to that here where like what are the implications about, like there's heavy commentary here about observer, like, and what the sort of ripples or echoes that the mere observer generates through trying to both generatively, I'll go back to slide number 1, like the output of the looking, and then also the feeding in of the, we say consumption here, but like the input as well are both being shaped. And like we can all go back and say, oh, we know, the old thing about, are you seeing reality or are you seeing an illusion? Is that illusion facilitated by how much your physical form, genomic bottleneck or otherwise, is like constraining that space automatically? And I think Avery's kind of getting at a deeper. Oh, I wanted also mention before I forget, related to this, basal affectivity, Thomas Fuchs. Like, I think some of what Avery's getting at is that low, like, what are the modifiers on basal, lowest level stuff? Even Fuchs, I always remember Fuchs, he talks about that, like, just basic feeling of any kind. Or
The
like
feeling of being alive.
minimum viable feeling or sensation. And then also he goes on to how emotion in his usage here has a directive quality of, okay, towards or away from. Like, it's not just like feeling anything at all. And I think this has primordial origins of like, are you feeling alive or not? Yes or no? Okay, now I can move in space or move toward the good thing and away from the bad thing, like that kind of stuff. Like, I think I'll leave it there. Yeah.
One of the main things I want to look into is like the idea that like information systems process more efficiently when information is in a shared format. I'm not sure what that would be, but I want to look more into that because it seems like really.
We can continue this discussion if we have time to do it, but so people can go enjoy the things. Let's administrative talk for 5 more minutes about what to do next time. Do we want to have another beer? And by that I mean beer paper. Or do you want to go in like a different direction? What are we feeling after this?
There's the Van Gelder paper itself, which I started to read it, but I can't fully vouch for it. Or there's the philosophical transactions issue that we were published in. The other papers there are, there's like 6 of them that I really want to read. So I'd be happy to pick basically anything from that publication.
Any votes from Bradley or Morgan on that? And obviously Avery too.
Yeah, I think the philosophical transactions would be great to go through some of the other papers.
I'll just read the titles of the papers that I bookmarked. Goals and the structure of experience. What does it mean to have an experience? 2 kinds of narrative world models. Unexpected benefits of self-modeling in neural systems. Topological constraints on self-organization in locally interacting systems. Something about AI. And then Levin's brains and where else. So there's variety there.
I'm curious to learn more about Levin, so I'd be down for the Levin paper.
Topological constraints, one just going off of what I know from Avery's presentation and the title of this seems like it might be.
Let's do it.
You're right. That does sound relevant.
Okay, cool. Then thanks to those who want to stop by and for joining today. We'll do this one next time. And then I'll be around for a bit